Welcome to the Peaceful Empath Summit. Get off the emotional roller coaster, find your path to peace, and feel your life transform. I'm your host, Monica Owsichek. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how empaths often have an early experience of trauma and how many of us spend years trying to heal the trauma and understand our roles as empaths. Our guest is Michelle Agopsowicz. Michelle is a Reiki master and has a master's in social work. She offers counseling and education opportunities from a holistic, trauma-informed perspective. She aims to create wellness and balance through the integration of traditional counseling and mindfulness techniques. Her approach has been developed through her own journey of having an autoimmune condition, trauma, and anxiety. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me, Monica.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here today. I'm excited to talk about all things trauma and empath because I really think that's just something really important for us to understand as empaths. Let's just take a moment and let's just take a deep breath in together just to get started. So let's take a deep breath in and let it out. Awesome. All right. So as empaths, we all have different experiences of how we come to find out that we're empaths. And can you just start by sharing, what does being an empath mean to you?
Yeah, so I think this changes over time. What I might have answered that as 10 years or 30 years ago might be different. What it means to me today is really empowerment. So it allows me to be in the world in a way where I can read other people, I can read situations. It keeps me safe, it keeps other people safe. And I'm at this place in my journey of being an empath where I feel like I can more easily discern what is mine and what is other people's. Whereas a few years ago, I would have said that I was a bit more victim to being an empath, that I was soaking up everybody's stuff all the time, family lineage stuff, everything you could imagine. And I feel like today it comes with this place of being able to feel other people's experiences and then also hand it back to them with love, or transmute it back to the universe with love and come back to my center. And I feel like my journey as an empath, I feel I probably always was one. And I say, as I'm sure most of your listeners are, and I believe that we all have the ability to be empaths in different situations. When I was younger, it was often a result of traumatizing things happening. And then a result of me being too hyper focused, like the antenna was too finely tuned for future danger. And so I was soaking up everybody's stuff. And so I did that, I think, probably till I was about probably in my early 20s. And I got really tired of everybody saying I was too sensitive, that I couldn't be a counselor because I was too sensitive. I was going to pick everybody else's stuff up. Why was I crying all the time? Why was I crying about the trees and the birds and the squirrels, as well as humanity and everything else? And then I spent most of my 20s trying to shut it off, trying to be less sensitive, trying to be a little bit more detached, feeling like that's what I had to do within the structure of our world just to survive. And it was also what everybody else was telling me I had to do to survive. And then in my 30s, I paid the price for shutting my empath abilities down. So I feel like I had spent my 20s intellectualizing my trauma, working through it, but never really integrating it into my body. And it wasn't till I got diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, and I knew immediately what that was. I knew it was because I had hated myself. I had hated my body. I tried to shut down who I was. And I got this glaring big trauma, this big event that really shook me to my core and woke me up and got me back onto the path of reclaiming being an empath. But this time around, really feeling like I was more of an empowered empath versus it happening to me all the time.
Question there. So, did you know you were an empath this whole time, or was it this health, this autoimmune that caused you to learn that, or did you know that before and you were trying to hide from it in a sense and deny it?
I feel like I learned the word
Mm,
empath when I had the autoimmune condition. And it just resonated as true. As well as being a highly sensitive person, it made my anxiety make sense. It made my social anxiety make sense. So I discovered the label at like 34 when I had the autoimmune condition. I absolutely, looking back, know that's exactly who I was at 3 and
mm,
at 10 and 15. So my dad has been ill his entire life and my entire life, but his health issues really started ramping up when I was 3. And energetically, I would say that is the moment when the pathway of being an empath really got laid down,
mm,
because I started to do the emotions for the family. And so family lineage stuff kind of picked up at that point. So at 3, I really learned to read the room, to read what people wanted, to read what people needed, to not be too much trouble to anyone. And I don't think it was into my 30s, though, where I realized it was a choice as to how much I wanted to be taking on or not taking on from other people.
I can see that. So you're saying at around 3 is where it just kind of kicked into high gear because of your circumstances,
Yeah.
right?
And I feel like it at the time was a coping strategy that actually was really brilliant. It kept me, 10 steps ahead of whatever next thing was needed in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it taught me how to meet my own needs, but it also taught me how to meet everybody else's needs first, too.
So between the age of 3 and in your 30s, you were really honing those
Yeah.
empathic skills without even knowing it.
Yeah. And I feel like in my 40s now, I feel like it's something I'm really proud of. I feel like it's the ultimate gift in so many ways.
Mm,
And I've really learned through mindfulness and Reiki and just understanding my own body, how to be grounded, how to take a breath, how it feels safe to be in your body, really allowed me to realize that I could pick up other people's stuff, but I can also put it down again.
mhm. So, can you tell me just a little bit more about figuring out that you were an empath?
Mhm.
So, you're going along living in a sense as an empath, right? Absorbing
Mhm.
all the energy, but not knowing it. And then you're in your 30s. What happened? How did you realize that?
Yeah, I think it would be nice to say that it was a beautiful spiritual epiphany in some ways. That would be very nice. The autoimmune condition really threw me into about a 3, 4 year process of this dark night of the soul. So continuous panic attacks, anxiety, feeling like I was dying, this depths of my soul awakening. And so I got to a place where there was no choice but to do something else, because the alternative was to get sicker and sicker and sicker. So it was one of those rock bottom moments where you decide, absolutely not. I am choosing not to live in this place of sickness. I want to be in a place of empowerment. And then it took me another year or so to kind of climb out of that hole and really understand and claim that process of being an empath. But as a soul, I was aware there was a crossroads there, I think, in a lot of ways.
So, where did you first hear the word empath? Sounds like it was more of a progression or
Yeah, it was definitely a progression. I was looking for alternative things to help with anxiety and panic, to understand what was going on for me. So I think it went from, because another one of my coping strategies is to over intellectualize things as a coping, and which I think a lot of empaths do actually too. When it's hard to be in our body and with our emotions, sometimes we pop out of our body and retreat to our heads. I was on this mission to research everything possible. And when no psychology or medicine can answer my questions, I had also started my Reiki training at that point. And so I also then started to look down more esoteric routes as to explaining my experience and why I had always felt like I didn't quite belong here on Earth. And so I would say it was definitely a progression that came out of desperate Googling for answers.
Oh, Google.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that desperation, you came across the word empath. You came across that definition and it just really resonated for you.
Yeah, I actually think I came across the definition of highly sensitive person first. And I sort of started really looking at that because my psychology counselor brain could get kind of on board with that. And then from that, I started to look into kind of other ways of being. And then I kind of came across empath as well as, all of our psychic abilities. So clairaudience and clairsentience, and how does that stay in our body? And then throughout my Reiki training, I just started going deeper and deeper in meditation and getting more information too about what trauma does in terms of relation to being an empath. And of course, I have no scientific research on this, but what I think happens is that when we're empaths, we sort of displace ourselves to hold for someone else. And then we forget to put ourselves back into the center and move them out. So it gets pretty crowded in the center of our being, and trauma and stress makes it easier to bump us out of our center and other people to crowd in there.
So once you realized that you were doing that, how did you bump yourself back in?
Yeah. So I do a few different things. I definitely have a pretty dedicated daily meditation Reiki practice. I also do things like tap along my collarbones and just repeat my name. So I will say, I am Michelle Maria Agopsowicz, and only Michelle Maria Agopsowicz. And I call back all of my energy, any energy that's been given, any energy that's been taken. I call it back home to me, and I send the energy back home where it belongs. So I spend quite a bit of time very intentionally calling home my energy and the bits that I've sort of allowed to leak out throughout the day. I also feel like nature and anything that gets us grounded, so drinking water, being in nature, and just moving our body, also reminds us that there's something else happening, that we have a human form that needs to be attended to in that way. So I do lots of energy and mindfulness techniques, but I would say that the one I do between every single client I say is I repeat my name 3 times, just that I am this person and only this person.
I like that. Just brings you back to yourself.
And the reason why I sort of tap along the bottom of the collarbones while I'm doing that is because it gets us back in our bodies, as well as there's an acupressure point there too that just stimulates the vagus nerve, which triggers our nervous system that it's okay to calm down and come back home to ourselves.
So you are a Reiki master and a counselor, correct?
Yes, it was counseling, and then I added Reiki, and I feel like it's enhanced my counseling practice in many ways because I did start to understand what is my energy versus other people's. But I also, perhaps one of my biggest awakenings within discovering that I was an empath was that I had no idea what it actually meant to be grounded. So I could talk about it, but I didn't actually know how it felt. And Reiki helped me to figure out, oh, this is what grounded feels like. This is what it feels like to be at home in your body. And so what I help my clients a lot with too is also figuring out, how does it feel to actually be grounded versus just talk about being grounded.
And how do you do that?
Yeah, I think some of the techniques I was just saying about calling their energy back, also about just that really getting into that breath work and noticing what that breath does for us. Can we feel our feet? Can we be connected to something, to nature? Can we ground? And I think I often thought that grounding might be just something I do once and then I'm grounded. So I think it's also really helping people to understand that grounding is something, I probably need to do 20 times a day. And some days I forget to ground. And then I start to feel overwhelmed and I start to feel panicky and I start to feel like I don't know what's mine and what's humanity's and what's my neighbor's. And so then it's about remembering that it's an ongoing practice to come back to the breath over and over and over again and remind ourselves that it's safe to be in our own body and our own feelings.
I've heard you say the word safe a few times now, especially in your own journey and what being an empath means to you. I feel like that is such a huge piece. It's feeling safe because it's almost like when we first learn that we're absorbing other people's energy. Why am I doing that? Why would I want to do that? And it does come back to feeling safe and feeling grounded in your body and in the whole process of it, of living with that, what is a gift and a superpower.
Yeah. And I think culturally, we get taught to ignore that. So we get praised in our culture for being busy, for overachieving, for pushing through, for pushing past our limits. And I think that was one of my profound lessons in discovering I was an empath too, is that other people might push past their limit, but I'm not doing that anymore because it comes at the cost of disease process for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am clear on my boundaries now as well in terms of what I will say yes to. So there's lots of people who are beautiful extroverts out in the world doing all sorts of busy things. It's okay that I'm not that person.
Do you find the people that you work with are mainly empaths? Do you find that you attract that?
I definitely find that I attract that. Or I find that there's also another small subset of people who will say, I actually don't know how to label my feelings or have emotions at all. And I feel like I attract them because then my job for them is to teach them how to have a language of emotions.
And you talk a lot about trauma, and you feel like the trauma in your life is what led you to discover you were an empath.
Yeah,
Do you see that a lot?
I see that a lot. And I guess the caveat I would like to give about trauma as well is that when we think about trauma, we often think about terrorism or natural disasters or sexual assaults, these really big earth-shattering events. When I'm speaking about trauma, I'm sort of speaking about the messiness of being a human. So traumas also essentially involve anything that has overwhelmed our ability to cope. And that's different for everybody. So for me, it was my dad's illness, and then later on, an event of sexual abuse. But for many people, it might be a divorce. It might be a grief in some way. It might be just that you've got 10 small things going on, and suddenly you're feeling really overwhelmed by what's going on. And when we're feeling overwhelmed, when our body can't handle and process that, I consider that a trauma. And it's different for other people. It's pretty easy to compare traumas to say, well, mine's not a trauma because other people have worse stories than I do. It's really this individual experience. And as empaths, oftentimes we're overwhelmed by the sadness and tragedy of humanity more easily than other people are. And you need to own that that is what's overwhelmed you. And it's okay. It's not about comparing. There's also lots of empaths who became empaths as a way to survive childhood abuse. So if you can be finely tuned to what your alcoholic parent or your parent who has mental health or your parent who is abusive, if you're highly tuned to the mood in the room, then you have the beautiful coping strategy of knowing not to make that parent angry today, or to be to be very people pleasing today, or to be very sweet, or to stay out of the way, or to not say anything. And that also tunes this antenna of being able to read the energy of the room. And if that was your childhood, then it's about reclaiming that as a beautiful superpower in your adulthood that, yes, came out of something tragic, but out of that comes this gift of who you are and what you can give to the world. Because I also have not met very many empaths who aren't an incredible gift of healing to everyone around them.
So true. And I think that trauma is a big piece of that a lot of times. Everyone copes differently, but not everyone is absorbing
Yes.
all that. And I think that that's the major difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if we think of ourselves as sponges and we're absorbing it, we need to remember to wring out the sponge afterwards, right?
Yeah, I like that. And that's kind of in line with the tools that you were saying, right? Like the grounding, the tapping, the saying your name. You talk a lot about the empowerment of being an empath. Describe that a little bit more.
Yeah. I think it's the same as what you say, Monica, with it being a superpower. So when we're empowered, we're in this place where we can go around and help people, which is what I think our most empaths' purpose is, to be helpers. Most of us are helpers. And so it allows us to go and spread our light in the world. It allows us to go around and help all those people we want to help, and then come home to ourselves without having to carry the weight of everyone else's stuff, because it's not our responsibility to do other people's work. One of the things that helped me think about being an empowered empath is, if I go around fixing everything and feeling everything for everyone else, I'm actually robbing them of the opportunity to discover that themselves. And when we don't discover a learning and a healing on our own, we often have to learn it again, because it doesn't really land in that epiphany way where we're like, whoa, I just integrated. That really means something. It doesn't mean the same thing if someone else has come and told you to do that work. So I try to think of being an empowered empath also by not injecting myself into every situation without other people actually giving me permission to be there either. So in the past, I would have gone along and fixed everybody's problems and felt everybody's feelings. And probably at least 70% of the time, they hadn't asked for my help. So it helped me to also think about, okay, but they haven't given me consent then to go do their work, nor do I want to do their work. If they'd like to ask me, then I'm more than happy to walk on that journey with them. And so I think when you get into this place of being an empowered empath, it's just information. And that information is great, but it doesn't mean you need to act or do anything about it. And is that to say that I'm always an empowered empath? Absolutely not.
Right.
I still bleed all over the place a lot of the time. But when I realize, and I guess maybe this is the second step, when I realize I'm kind of expanding out into everybody's and feelings, everybody's things, I'm at least curious and aware enough of it now to remind myself to come back to me. Whereas before, it really happened to me versus me choosing to have it happen to me or not.
Yes, I can relate to that. And that's why I call the summit the Peaceful Empath, because I feel like peace is such a powerful place to be in. Healing isn't linear. We're figuring things out. And I feel like we are given the opportunity to figure things out at certain periods, at certain layers, and we may be going deeper later. So like you said, things are going to come up again for us to learn deeper in a different way at a different time. Yeah. And to be able to accept that instead of get into that place of like, oh man, I thought I figured this out.
Yeah, healing is this like circular spiral unfolding. And I think exactly as you say, right, that what it means to be an empowered or peaceful empath in 10 years is going to be even more firm in your sense of being, because you'll have healed it a few more times. You know, life has a way of returning our themes to us when we're ready to look at it again. And most of us go, oh, like, I don't want to do it again. I already did it. I thought I'd done that to completion, but I think there's also something empowering about knowing we're not ever going to do it to completion. So just enjoy the ride and enjoy the learning as you go versus feeling like we come to these end points, which we never do.
If I'm depending on if I'm in a peaceful place, I can think of it as, oh, I'm being shown or given another opportunity to learn something maybe in a different way.
Yes.
So try to look at it that way instead of, dang it, this is happening again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a good point because if we're not in a peaceful place, if we're at this place where we are a bit overwhelmed, then again, we can go back to this place where it feels like it's really happening to us and we're victim to it. And we all go there sometimes. I know this word victim it has a lot of energy behind it too, but we are all in that place at some point where it feels like it's happening to us versus us having the ability to walk through it of our own volition.
Right. I'm curious, the difference when you didn't know you were an empath to after when you did, what were the major changes that you felt? Did you feel it in relationships? I think of the relationship to your dad that you mentioned, and I mean, even the relationship to yourself, but what were the major things that you feel shifted for you?
I think the major thing that shifted for me was for the first time in my life, I knew how to feel grounded, as I said. The second one was that the first time in my life, I actually felt I had an appreciation and some semblance of self-love for myself. And I don't think I had any idea what that actually was before I reclaimed being an empath. So what it gave me more than anything was probably self-love. So I felt like I suddenly had a place to belong. I had language to put behind my experience. I wasn't the only one. I wasn't alone. And so then I had this ability to say, okay, so even though everybody told me for the first 18 years of my life that there was something wrong with me for being so sensitive, turns out that's not true. Turns out we're all meant to be feeling beings and not just robots of intellectualization. Not that we don't need our mind as well. We need a balance of all of these things. And so I feel like discovering I was an empath, having the autoimmune condition, I felt like it put me on this trajectory of self-love and self-compassion for who I am uniquely as me and being able to claim that rather than trying to be someone that I'm not or turn some part of me off that I can't turn off, because when I turned it off, I got really sick.
Do you feel like were you on this quest for self-love before, and it just looked different, or was self-love not really even on the table?
No, I don't think it was even really on the table. I constricted my food intake. I over-exercised. I did all sorts of things and spoke to myself in a way and I was perfectly content to stay there. I was perfectly content to stay in this place of, well, I'm not pretty enough and I'm not thin enough and I'm not, smart enough and and I was pretty comfortable there, even though it was making me sick. And the moment I got that diagnosis, this did come as an epiphany. It was like, oh my God, you've hated yourself forever. And now your body is saying, well, if you don't like us so much, we're going to start giving up on you.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly it was like this whole thing opened up where it's like, I need to learn how to love myself for who I am, including all of my emotions and sensitivity and all of those things. So suddenly I don't think in any way, I love this question, Monica, because I don't think I've thought about it in this way. I don't think it was in any way on my radar before that.
I ask because a lot of times we hear that, right? Like, oh, you need to love yourself, and this is self-love, and this is self-care. And I think sometimes we can think we're doing that and loving ourselves and trying whatever that means. And then it can shift, and
Yeah.
it just sinks in a different way. So I was curious if that happened or if it wasn't even on the radar, like you said.
Yeah, I think it might have been slightly on the radar, but again, from a very intellectual place, because in order to survive not having my feelings and everyone else's feelings, I went and got a master's degree and all sorts of, like I really went fully into understanding the process versus feeling the process. And I think when I discovered I was an empath, I got this balance back where suddenly my head and my heart were speaking the same language. They weren't warring with each other anymore. And
Right.
does that mean I have self-love all the time and self-compassion all the time? Again, no.
Return to self-love, just like you return to peace.
Exactly. But I do at least know when I'm sliding out of balance now.
I love that. I feel like, awareness is so huge, right? It's the
Yeah.
first step, awareness that you're an empath, awareness of what you were doing and not doing, and
Yeah.
coming back to awareness. And
Yeah.
so when you had that epiphany that you were not loving yourself, that you were actually almost hating yourself in a sense, you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
what was the next step? What did that look like?
Mm-hmm.
It, how did it shift? How did it
Yeah.
change?
Yeah. And I'd like to say that even though I had the epiphany in terms of a thought and a knowing, so I knew that the autoimmune condition was related to this. I had a deep intuitive knowing about that. But like I said before, it took me a couple years for my nervous system to stop having panic attacks and anxiety, because I really did think I was dying in that process. And so throughout this process, I knew my true north. I knew where I was headed. I was like, I'm headed to find self-compassion, self-love, and reclaiming who I am. I knew where I was headed. The journey to get there, though, did involve some deep, dark, wooded passages with some big bad wolves along the way. And I felt like it just kind of got revealed to me a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. If I use that metaphor again, as I was walking through the woods, suddenly I realized there's a flashlight in my pocket and I've walked this trail before. And so there was things that started to reveal themselves. At the time, I didn't know if I was going to survive it.
Mm-hmm. And is that when you found Reiki too?
Yeah. Yeah. So I also had that happening at the same time, like all of the detox and awakening that comes from sort of that whole process as well. But I also don't think that that was coincidence either, as to exactly when Reiki found its way into my life.